Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Jay and welcome to Simple Church Online. Whether you missed last Sunday, you're checking us out for the first time, or maybe even watching out of state, we're so glad that you're a part of our community. And we're praying today that as you watch, God would use this to bless your life. Enjoy the message.
Okay, I want to start with a quote that is often attributed to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We can find no record that he actually said it, but if he didn't say it, he would dadgum well agree with it. It's this: silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Sometimes indecision is a decision. Sometimes silence is an answer. Sometimes not taking action is the action we end up taking. We cannot remain silent. This week's, the title of the message is, I'm calling it The Silence. It's about the cost of silence. And again, we want to start with 1930s Germany. As I researched this, I was surprised. I considered myself a little bit of a World War II buff. That period of history has always fascinated me. Hitler started making some really big power moves very early into his reign. And so in 1933, he passed a law called the Restoration Act, and there was an Aryan clause in it that said that no Jews could serve in government positions. Now, Jews do not mean, in this sense, people who identify religiously as Jewish. This is an ethnicity. It's a race that the Germans were bent on getting out of Germany. They wanted to purify their nation. And what's more than that is a government position counted as the German Lutheran Church. It was a state-sponsored church. And so no ethnic Jew all of a sudden cannot pastor in the German Lutheran Church. This was a bridge too far for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had a dear friend who was ethnically Jewish, who was a pastor alongside him in the Lutheran Church of the day. And so Bonhoeffer wrote a scathing essay to respond to this. It was called Hitler and the Jewish Question. This is also in 1933. And people said, "You're being too extreme. You're being too radical. Just calm down. Let's wait this thing out. The pendulum has swung a little too far. It'll swing back." But Bonhoeffer was not ready to be silenced. He saw the writing on the wall. And what we see as the red flag warning signs, he saw those and knew that Germany needed to act. And so he got together with some fellow leaders in the church, and they wrote this kind of declaration. It was called the Barmen Declaration. And it basically was saying exactly what we're talking about, that this law is unjust. This is a bridge too far. The German government cannot reach into the church to decide the fate of the church. They sent this thing to 18,000 Protestant pastors in Germany. Okay, that's just the Protestant pastors. They sent this thing to everybody. Do you want to guess what the response was? There were about 3,000 who signed on with Bonhoeffer and company, said, "You know what, you're absolutely right. We're putting our name on this. The government is overstepping. They're going too far." About 3,000 staunchly opposed. They said Hitler is the guy, and he is bringing Germany back into greatness. And we want to create a Reichskirche. We want to create a government church, which that in itself is hilariously ironic to me, because Hitler gave lip service in public to the church, but he hated the church. He wanted a world that was devoid of religion. He wanted to push the church and Christianity to the side and out of the public sphere. He wanted that to be something that you practice in private on Sunday morning and in your own home, and it better never come out into the public marketplace. That certainly doesn't sound like anything we're dealing with culturally now, does it? Bonhoeffer expected resistance. He wasn't surprised by the brothers who opposed him. What broke Bonhoeffer's heart was the other 12,000. 12,000 of those 18,000 pastors didn't take a side one way or the other. They didn't say we're for you. They didn't say we're against you. They were silent. And that absolutely broke Bonhoeffer's heart. Many of them were undoubtedly scared Hitler was already using intimidation tactics. And in fact, by 1935, 700 of the 3,000 who had signed on with Bonhoeffer had been arrested. Some thought that let's just wait this out. Let's just see what will happen. Again, surely that pendulum will swing back toward normal. Because many of them probably didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. They didn't know that Hitler was going to do what he was going to do. We have the benefit of hindsight. A common refrain that Bonhoeffer got was that many wanted to avoid being political. I don't want to be political, man. I just want to preach the gospel. Sounds really good. It's a good little Jesus juke of not having to get involved. I don't want to be political. And church, can I just be really transparent with you all? I've been in some form of ministry for about 20 years of my life now, and that's been a hallmark of my ministry. I don't want to be political. I don't want to get on the Republican or the Democrat or other side. I don't want to drive anybody away needlessly. I just want to focus on Jesus. But the church has to speak. We cannot remain silent. As I mentioned, the Lutheran Church was Germany's state church, and it had a great deal of power and influence at the time. One historian that I read said that if even 3,000 more pastors had signed on with Bonhoeffer and company to become what they called the confessing church, Hitler and the Nazis would not have been able to do everything that they did. The church was that influential. And imagine if 6,000 more had signed on, or 9,000. Imagine if the whole church together had taken a stand and said, no, government, you govern the nation. You don't get to govern the church. This church subordinates to God and to God only. Imagine. And again, this is a sobering reality. We have that benefit, that luxury of hindsight, because all these power moves that Hitler was making, all these little steps to strip away freedoms and powers and to do horrible things to Jews, it was incremental. We see all those things as the red flags leading up to the culmination of what happened, especially in the early 40s. The people of Germany didn't see all that. They were only in it as they were experiencing it. But we've got to recognize signs and dangers today. One man tried to do that about 15 years ago. There's a guy named Chuck Colson. I wonder if some of y'all know that name. Chuck Colson is a good man. I think he's died now, but he was a good man who loved the Lord. He was actually President Richard Nixon's hatchet man. He was like the guy that would go do all the bad stuff and silence people. And when Watergate went down, which, can we be honest, the Watergate scandal is like such small potatoes compared to the nonsense that we see in the media today. Neither here nor there, but Colson went to prison for his involvement in Watergate. And while he was in prison, he found Jesus. He surrendered his life to Jesus. And when he got out, he started doing some incredible ministry. Look him up sometime. Chuck Colson did some great stuff. Well, in 2009, he was really concerned about the direction our country was trending, specifically in the way the church was being pushed to the side. And granted, we can talk about the things that the church did wrong through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where we wielded our power and influence, and we said it's about, let's not look like the people out there. We've got to follow the rules and do all the right things and this and that, and you're going to hell if you don't follow us and do what we do. We did some things wrong, but the government has also pushed us more and more to the side. I think Pastor Jay mentioned in the 1950s there was the law passed that said churches from the pulpit cannot tell you what opponent we think you should political candidate we think you should vote for, or we lose our tax-exempt status. Where were the pastors standing up and screaming at the top of our lungs that this is unjust when that happened? Again, I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic. Chuck Colson, 2009, concerned about the church being pushed to the side as if it's a private matter only. He got together with a couple of other leaders. Really, they borrowed heavily from what Dietrich Bonhoeffer had done in 1933 when they drafted that Barmen Declaration. And they created what they called the Manhattan Declaration. And it called for protection of religious liberty and religious conscience. These are foundational American values that they believed were being threatened. Some of them included that Christians should not be forced to perform abortions, that Christians should not be forced to perform same-sex weddings, etc., etc. And if the government tries to do that, we need to engage in civil disobedience. He referenced the great Martin Luther King Jr. in his incredibly nonviolent approach that revolutionized America. They sent this out far and wide to all the influential pastors in America. And can you guess what happened? Silence. And it broke Colson's heart. These weren't just people he viewed as his colleagues in ministry. These were people he viewed as his friends, people he'd shared stages with at various events. And he even called some of them out by name. Where was this influential pastor? Where is that influential pastor? Why are they not willing to stand when our church is being threatened? There was a young lady who grew up in Nazi Germany. She was in high school. She actually got to meet Adolf Hitler in high school, and she was a huge fan of the work he was doing. But then she saw where it all went and how evil it turned. And she eventually escaped and made it to America and studied sociology because she was baffled by how afraid people were to speak out and what happened. So she created this theory called the spiral of silence. Her name was Elizabeth Noel Newman. And the idea basically goes that as silence continues, the risk of speaking out becomes greater and greater. So if someone had spoken out early on against Hitler, probably not much would have happened. By the early 1940s, if someone spoke out, they were quickly silenced, right? The opposite is also true. That when someone speaks up, it encourages and emboldens others to speak up as well. We actually just read about this last Wednesday in our men's group Bible study in Philippians 1. Paul talks about how his sharing the gospel in the prison cell he was in had encouraged others to share the gospel as well. Or think about in the last several years, the Me Too movement, where previously these actors and actresses who had experienced this horrible sexual harassment assault, and they'd stayed silent because they're afraid of their careers being ruined, all of a sudden one or two speak up, and the floodgates open, and the veil is pulled back on how evil this industry really is. When someone speaks, it encourages others to do the same. When we remain silent out of fear, it gets harder and harder to break out of the silence. Pardon me, I need a drink of water. I wonder if any of you have heard the name Harrison Butker this week. Yeah? He's the incredibly famous kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's one of the very best kickers in the NFL. He happens to be a really devout traditional Catholic. And this last week or so, he got invited to give a commencement address at a traditional Catholic university. And for some reason, our world is surprised when a traditional Catholic, speaking at a traditional Catholic school, espouses traditional Catholic values. But that's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying that I agree with every single word that Harrison Butker said, but I have been dumbfounded by the cultural response this guy has gotten. Last time I checked, this was a couple days ago, there was a petition on change.org that Harrison Butker needed to be removed from the Chiefs. And can I just say, as his teammates, as the city of Kansas City, as the NFL has distanced itself from Harrison Butker, I find it so hypocritical. Because this is the same league where some of these guys will go and they are accused and guilty of sexual harassment, sexual assault. They're guilty of beating their wives and their children, their girlfriends. Okay, we'll suspend you for a couple of games, and you better say you're sorry, but then it's fine. We'll sweep that under the rug. That's okay. But this guy thinks that maybe women should enjoy being mothers and wives. He didn't say don't get a career. He said, but God has given you a unique gift. Step into it. This guy's got to go. This guy's a monster. It's dumbfounding to me. Why do I tell you all this, church, my dear church friends and family? We can't remain silent. We can't afford to remain silent. The world is so dark and so devoid of truth and drifting further and further away from God. And it's not that we're better than anybody. And it's not that we want to beat people over the head with anything, But we've got to shine the light. We've got to speak truth so people can know. You've probably heard the King James Version of Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. Have you heard that one before? Where there's no vision, the people perish. Churches love to trot this one out when they're coming up with their new vision statement, right? And we have a vision statement, and you walked in under it, and it's great. Can anyone rattle that off for me? The vision statement you walked in under out here? Close. We exist to change the world's narrative of God by becoming more like Jesus every day. There's not a wasted word in that, and I love it. Vision statements are good. They're helpful for churches, for organizations, because it helps everyone kind of move the same direction. But this scripture means so much more than that. It's more about a revelation from God. It's about hearing the truth of God, being guided by the truth of God. So more modern translations reflect that. Here's the NIV version of Proverbs 29:18. Where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint, but blessed is the one who heeds wisdom's instruction. Or the New Living Translation, which is our most common preaching translation, says this: when people do not accept divine guidance, they run wild, but whoever obeys the law is joyful. When there's no vision, when we take our eyes off the truth of God, when we're not encountering the truth of God, there's no revelation and no exposure to God's truth, we drift. We become more and more like the culture around us. But when there is that truth, when we submit to the lordship of God and of Jesus in our lives and say, Lord, speak your truth, have your way, it says there's joy. That's where the real life is, church. When we give up our rights to ourselves, give up our rights to our lives, we find real life in Jesus. It's always been like this, too. In the Old Testament, when the people of Israel had strong, godly leaders, the people of Israel followed faithfully. Those leaders kept on bringing them back to the truth, showing them the way. When they would start to creep out of bounds, they would guide them back. When they didn't have good, strong, godly leaders, they drifted. They drifted far away from God. A part of that, excuse me, there was this belief in the ancient Near East in regional gods. So this country would have their gods, this country had their gods, so on and so forth. And the idea was that if you moved to a new place, maybe you bring your gods with you, but you better learn to keep the gods of the land that you're moving to happy. And we even see that when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and pulled all the Israelites and lived with them in Assyria, they left some Assyrians to take care of the land, and they had trouble. They had lots of trouble because God was not happy. And so they sent back some of the priests of the Lord to teach them how to worship and pacify this regional God. Well, God knew that if the people of Israel, if his people went into the land of Canaan that would become Israel, and they didn't get rid of the people who were worshiping false gods, which the Apostle Paul calls demons. He doesn't say they're just not real. There may very well be power to it. It's just not power you want to get mixed up with. He knew if they didn't get rid of all of that they would intermarry and they would be led astray, which is what happened time after time. What God was doing in the nation of Israel, he wanted to create a people that were set apart for him. The rules and the things that he gave them were to teach them how to interact with God, how to be right with him, and how to be different from the world around them. And he knew if they were in there with other people of false gods, they'd be led astray, and the distinction would no longer be clear. Our God is the one true God, and he demands our wholehearted devotion, and he always has. So in Israel, remember, they're in Egypt, they're slaves for 400 years. God raises up Moses to bring them out. Moses was a strong, godly leader. He wasn't perfect. None of the leaders were. But he kept on bringing them back to God. He took them to Sinai. He gave them the law. God used him to speak to his people Israel. He led them to the promised land. And granted, the first generation balked at it, and they were afraid, and they had to wander in the desert for 40 years, so the next generation that had learned how to trust and obey and depend on God for everything could go in and take the promised land. And remember, Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. He died, but Joshua led the people into the promised land. And he was another faithful, godly leader who kept the people on track. Well, they did not eradicate all of the people from the land of Canaan for one reason or another. And what happened was, as Joshua dies and Israel has settled, they enter a period where they're led by people called judges. And there's a whole book in the Old Testament called Judges that's this journey. And it wasn't judge like we think of as courtroom judge necessarily, it's more just a leader. But what happened was, the people would turn away from God. They would get oppressed by foreign enemies. They would cry out to God for deliverance. God would raise up for them a deliverer. Things would go back to good until that leader died. Some have called it the cycle of apostasy, which is fun if you want to impress your friends at lunch today. Tell them you learned about the cycle of apostasy. It's super fun. This cycle repeats 7 times through the book of Judges. But here's the thing. It's not this cycle where when they come back to the Lord, they're always back at ground zero to good. It's really more of a downward spiral. And the further we go in Judges, the further they get away from the truth of God. They come back around-ish, but every time they've lost a lot. There's been a huge cultural drift. Now, Judges takes about 300 years of Israel's history to go through. So it's a slow drift. Many generations involved, but it's a significant drift. The book of Judges ends. The very last verse of the book is 21:25, and it says this: "In those days Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." In those days Israel had no godly leader to bring the people back to what's true. So everybody did what they thought was right. You do you, boo. Do whatever makes you happy. Certainly there are no cultural parallels today. Eyes in the Bible represents the quality and focus of the soul. It's a very common image as you're reading the Bible. I don't know if some of you have ever been confused when Jesus is talking about you can't love both God and money. He talks about if the darkness if you think the light within you is, I'm getting it mixed up. If the darkness within you, you think it's light, how bad is that darkness? Basically, if you think you have God's wisdom and truth and you think you're walking in it, but you're not, you're in great spiritual danger. That's what that's all about. The people of Israel, their vision was not on God. There was no revelation. There was no guidance. So everybody did what seemed right in their own eyes. We don't have time today to go through the whole book of Judges, and nor would you want me to. But I want to highlight a few snippets that I think really help make the point of showing how far Israel had drifted, especially in the latter half of Judges. And again, this is about 300 years that it's covering. Very slow drift, but very significant. But over that time, they drifted more and more away from the Lord, and they didn't look like God's chosen people. They looked like the culture around them. You've probably heard of Gideon. Gideon was a small guy from a small tribe. He's hiding in fear of the Midianites. He's threshing wheat in a winepress to hide it from them. God comes to him and says, "You're going to be raised up and you're going to deliver my people Israel." And he's the one who famously puts his fleece out and says, "Okay, God, if you're really with me, make the fleece wet, but the rest of the ground dry." God does it. He's like, the next night, do it again, but the other way. He does it. Gideon raises this amazing army. But God says it's too much. You have too many. If you go into this battle, people are going to think you won it on your own. God wants to do things his way, and he wants to get the glory for those things. And so he whittles down Gideon's army to 300 men. And with that 300 men, they go to confront the Midianite force, who God throws into a terrible confusion, and they're fighting each other and then running away before Gideon and his men even start fighting with them. Gideon and his men chase them. They slaughter a bunch of them. They capture the leaders. And then we start to see that Gideon operates from a place of some vengeance and some anger. He's not perfect. He's done some great things, but he's not perfect. He's angry, and he puts these guys to death out of spite. He even falls into idolatry. This is near the end of the story after the victory. Judges 8:22 through 27. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian." But Gideon replied, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." Okay, that's a good answer, right? I don't want to be the powerful king. Let God be your king. Okay, we're doing well so far. However, I do have one request. That each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies. The enemies, being Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. "Gladly," they said. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants, the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Okay, you're the leader, you led the charge, cool, you should get like a little bit extra, that's cool. But look what Gideon does with it. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. That's not Oprah, okay? But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Gideon had drifted so far culturally that he didn't know that God didn't want him to make a sacred ephod. These were the garments that the priests wore. Only the priests were supposed to wear these things, and they were only supposed to do it in the tabernacle or the temple, the place where God chose to bring worship. Gideon makes this thing, and people start worshiping this thing. And it calls it prostitution. This is how seriously God takes our worship. When we put something or someone in the place of God, it's like stepping out of a marriage covenant. It's that serious. And it becomes a gigantic snare to Gideon and to his family and to all the people of Israel. Church, we cannot remain silent. There's a lesser-known judge after that named Jephthah. Anybody heard of Jephthah? Okay, awesome. Let me just introduce Jephthah to you the way Judges introduces Jephthah. This is Judges 11, 1 through 3. Now Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior. He was the son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also had several sons, and when these half-brothers grew up, they chased Jephthah off the land. "You will not get any of our father's inheritance," they said, "for you are the son of a prostitute." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him. This is not exactly like the resume that you want for your great leader. He's kind of a half-son of Gilead. His brothers chase him off, and he gets a bunch of worthless scoundrels hanging out with him. And yet, let's read what happens. Judges 11, 29 through 40. At that time, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he even went throughout the land of Gilead and Manasseh, including Mizpah and Gilead, and from there he led an army against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. He said, "If you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." These are the kinds of vows that people made to false gods in the ancient Near East. These are not the kinds of vows that God ever wanted his people to make. If he knew the scriptures that they had at that time, he would have known that. Now, maybe his wife had like this really obnoxious cat or something, and he was hoping like the cat would come out first, and he'd like get to ice the cat and it'd be done. But that's not what happens. Jephthah led his army against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave him victory. He crushed the Ammonites, devastating about 20 towns from Aroer to an area near Minnith and as far away as Abel-Keramim. By the way, if you're ever reading these things aloud and the names are horrible and hard to pronounce, just say it like you know and nobody knows better. It's okay. Just say it with great confidence, with gusto. In this way, Israel defeated the Ammonites. Now watch this. I know it's terrible. When Jephthah returned home to Mizpah, his daughter came out to meet him, playing on a tambourine and dancing for joy. She was his one and only child. He had no other sons or daughters. When he saw her, he tore his clothes in anguish. "Oh, my daughter," he cried out, "you've completely destroyed me. You've brought disaster on me, for I have made a vow to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." And she said, "Father, if you have made a vow to the Lord, you must do to me what you have vowed, for the Lord has given you a great victory over your enemies, the Ammonites. But first let me do this one thing. Let me go up and roam in the hills and weep with my friends for 2 months, because I will die a virgin." "You may go," Jephthah said, and he sent her away for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never have children. When she returned home, her father kept the vow he had made, and she died a virgin. So it's become a custom in Israel for young Israelite women to go away for 4 days each year to lament the fate of Jephthah's daughter. There's something that's absolutely maddening when we study the Old Testament, specifically the historical books. The narrator does not often tell us when somebody's way off track, when they're doing something that's really wrong. The narrator assumes we know the rest of the Bible and can apply that filter to the actions. That's what's happening here. Jephthah made a stupid vow, okay? He never should have made the vow. But when he gets home, and it's not the obnoxious cat that comes out first, it's his daughter, his only child. He should have known better, that the Lord, the God of Israel, would never want him to do something like that. He should have said, "You know what, Lord, I'm sorry, it was a stupid vow. Please forgive me. Thank you for the great victory. Thank you for the gift that is my daughter." He has respect for the Lord, clearly, but he doesn't know the Lord. A big part of why God was kicking out the nations that were living in Canaan that would become Israel was their worship of false gods. And one such false god was a demon named Moloch. And Moloch demanded the sacrifice of their children. And people did it. They sacrificed their children in a fire. God calls this abominable and detestable, and that's why he's vomiting them out of the land. Jephthah has so much become a product of his culture that he doesn't even know better. That this God whom he loves and respects, and this God who used him mightily, doesn't want him to kill his daughter. We cannot remain silent. Samson. Y'all probably know the story of Samson, right? The Incredible Hulk of the Bible. Oh. I actually read this interesting theory one time that people were so surprised by Samson's great strength because he was probably like this really normal-looking dude. Didn't look like the Hulk. I don't know. It doesn't matter. We'll know when we get to heaven. Samson has an amazing birth story. It's really on par with the birth of John the Baptist or when Abraham and Sarah have Isaac. And Samson was supposed to be set apart to God from day one. He was supposed to be a Nazirite from birth. And that term, the Nazirite vow, is a temporary vow where the people of Israel could, for a short period, they would abstain from strong drink like wine, other alcohol. They wouldn't cut their hair. They would make sure not to come into contact with anything that was unclean, which again, all that is just God teaching them how to be different from the world around them. Samson was supposed to be a Nazirite from birth for his whole life, specially set apart for the Lord. But when Samson grows up, and we first see him acting as an adult in the scriptures, the first things he does are basically break all of these things. So he wants to get married outside of Israel. He sees a Philistine woman and he says, "She's right in my eyes. Go get her for me." Remember we talked about eyes earlier, and everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. This woman is right in my eyes. Bring her to me. Which that was devastating for his parents, because they knew if he married outside of Israel, he'd be led astray. And Samson was just kind of an idiot, can we be honest? Especially when it came to women. He was a fool. So he doesn't treat the things of God with respect, and he certainly is led astray by women. So very shortly after he's seen this woman, he's on his way to visit her, and a lion attacks him, and he tears it apart with his bare hands, because that's awesome. And then later he goes back by, and some bees have swarmed in the carcass of the lion. Now, Israelites weren't allowed to touch dead bodies, most definitely a Nazirite from birth. But he scoops in and gets some of the honey and eats it. Not only does he touch it, he eats it. And I can't prove this to you from the scriptures, but Philistine wedding parties were week-long binge drinking affairs. He had 2 of them. He most likely drank alcohol at those parties. And of course, his second wife, Delilah, again, he's just such a fool. He's singing, "Hey there, Delilah." But both of his wives tricked him, and he fell for it both times. And he eventually tells Delilah the secret of his great strength, and the Philistines subdue him, and they gouge out his eyes, and they take him a prisoner, and he's grinding mill as a slave for the Philistines. And you know what he prays for? He just wants vengeance. That's where his heart is at. God had used him to do all these incredible things, to fight the Philistines, to begin to set Israel free. He just wants vengeance on his enemies. God gives it to him. His hair regrows, and he gets brought out, and they make fun of him at this festival to their fake god Dagon. And he's there on the pillars of the temple, and he gets strengthened one more time. He pushes the thing over. The whole thing caves in. Like 3,000 people die, and he dies with them. It's such a sad story. And yet God used him, as he used all of the flawed people, as he continues to use flawed people. In Judges 14:4, this is early on in the story of Samson, it says his father and mother didn't realize the Lord was at work in this, creating opportunity to work against the Philistines who ruled over Israel at that time. God didn't give Samson the desire for a Philistine woman, but he used it. He used it to pick a fight with a group that he was trying to deliver Israel from. After Samson, Judges ends with an absolutely horrifying account of a man and his concubine. And my oldest daughter, Audrey, and I, we read through books of the Bible lately, and it's been great. Like we read Esther and Ruth and one of the Gospels, and it's been really good. She wanted to go through Judges. I don't know why. I said, okay, but we're not reading like the last 2 chapters because it's that messed up. And as we've read through it, she's like, dude, this is messed up already. It gets worse? Yeah, baby, I promise it gets worse. There's a man who has a concubine, and they have a fight. The concubine runs away. A few months later, he goes to get her and bring her back. They're traveling, and they don't want to stay at a town of a foreign city because they might get mistreated, and instead they find their way to a town in Dan. It's a Gibeah of Dan. And they're in the city square, and a man comes out, and he says, where are you guys staying tonight? Come stay with me. And in the ancient Near East, hospitality was something that we just really can't even understand. The level that they took it to is such a big deal. And when you came under my home, you were under my protection. And I would do everything in my power to make sure you were safe. And so they go to stay with this man. And the men of the city surround the house, demanding that this man be brought out so that they can rape him. Again, the narrator is silent. But every good Israelite knows we're linking back to the height of wickedness in Genesis, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And remember, Lot and his family were to be spared from God's destruction of the city because it was so wicked. And so he sends angels who look like men, and the Newsboys wrote a great song about entertaining angels, and it's fantastic. But these 2 guys come in, and they come under Lot's house, and the men of the city surround the house, and they say, bring out the men so we can rape them. Lot says, I know, I'll send out my 2 virgin daughters to appease the crowd. Wicked in itself. The angels protected those girls. And thank God that they did. The angels struck the crowd blind. They lead Lot and his family out. The city is destroyed. That's where we get the hellfire and brimstone reference. Fast forward all these hundreds of years to the end of the time of the Judges. There's no one to protect these poor girls. The guy sends out his concubine. The man whose house they're in sends out his daughter. And the crowd rapes him all night. When the man gets up in the morning to try to leave, he goes out and he finds that his concubine has died. And so he cuts her body into 12 parts and sends one part of the body to each tribe of Israel. And as far as Israel has drifted away from God, as much as they've taken on their identity of the surrounding cultures, they recognize this is really, really bad. Such an outrageous thing has never been done in Israel. They put together an army, and they want to go wipe the tribe of Dan off the map, and that's exactly what they do. It starts the first civil war in Israelite history. But then they feel bad because they don't want the whole tribe of Dan to be gone. And so they basically say, okay, the few of you guys that are left, we don't want to give you our daughters, but if you want to go kidnap some girls, that's fine. This is how far they drifted away from being God's chosen people to this place of total depravity and wickedness. And then again, Judges ends with this verse, Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. Where there's no vision, the people perish. Where there's no revelation from God, where there is no divine guidance from God, we're on the road to ruin. Remember that says in the NLT version, when people do not accept divine guidance, they run wild. But whoever obeys the law is joyful. Church, we can't remain silent. This spiritual life that we are on, that we are trying to live, it's a treadmill. And if we are not actively walking, moving toward what is most true, prioritizing our lives around it, we're being pulled away, more and more becoming products of the culture around us. We personally can't go through a season of silence from God. We've got to continually hold God's truth in front of us. We've got to gather just like we are to worship, to hear God's truth proclaimed. We gather on Wednesdays to get together to dive deeper into the Word, to sharpen and encourage each other. We can't experience silence. Otherwise, we drift and we become more and more products of our culture. And we have got to be disciples of Jesus. Not disciples of Washington, not disciples of the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or Fox News or CNN. We can't be disciples of Wall Street. We can't be disciples of TikTok. We've got to be disciples of Jesus. We can't experience silence, and we cannot remain silent, church. We can't remain silent in our families. If we're not teaching our kids what's true and what's right and wrong, the world is happy to step in and do it for you. We can't remain silent in our church family as we walk through life with each other. When I start getting off track, I need those of you who love me and know me and see my life to call me back. Not because you're mean, but because you love me and you love my family. And we need to do that for each other, to protect each other, because we love each other. Real love tells the truth. If I have a blind spot in my life and you don't tell me about it, you don't love me. We can't remain silent in our spheres of influence. You guys interact so much more with people who are confused and lost and far from God than Pastor Jay and I do. We're actually fairly insulated. It's a funny thing that happens when you work at a church. If you guys will pray for and recognize and take opportunities to speak God's truth to those who are lost, you will impact lives for God's sake. You will impact the kingdom of God growing in our country. Now, I think we need churches standing up. I think we need leaders like the Chuck Colsons of the world, the Dietrich Bonhoeffers of the world, standing up and drawing a line in the sand, and this is where we are. We need church leaders to stand up and say, this is what's true. But we need all of us, as Christ followers, standing up and sharing the truth of God to a world that desperately needs to hear it. Next week, we're going to start to talk about how. How do I do that? But wait, there's more. Come back for the exciting conclusion next week. Don't leave today and go start posting angry on Facebook, okay? Absolutely no one's mind has ever been changed by a rant on Facebook, I promise. It either people agree with you or it makes them mad. Don't go to work tomorrow and tell your idiot coworker that they're an idiot, okay? That's not helping anything. I know, I'm a killjoy, I'm sorry. Start praying about how you can speak truth in your contexts. And we'll come back together next week, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Thank y'all for bearing with me today. I know this has been a little bit heavy. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been encouraged to keep walking on the treadmill toward God, toward what really matters. Because I don't want us to look like a church that just reflects culture. This is God's church, and He will protect it.
Once again, thank you for stopping by today. We'd love for you to be a part of our family at one of our services. You can find out all of our information at simplechurchtulsa.com, and we'd love to pray for you any way we can, so please message us, and we hope you have a great week.